You boys be quiet down there!
Welcome back to PC-88 Paradise, the series where we take a close look at classic games for the NEC PC-88, the most popular Japanese PC series of the 1980s. In the early 80s, Nintendo made a deal with Hudson to allow them to port some of their games to Japanese PCs, and even create some original games based on their existing titles. Some of you may remember my video on Mario Bros. Special for PC-88 from last year. That was a game based on the old Mario Bros. Single-screen arcade game. However, today's video is about a game based on Super Mario Bros. For the NES. So please allow me to proudly present...
Super Mario Brothers
Special!
So here's the actual game in the flesh. It's quite rare and expensive, but I managed to obtain it in order to give it the proper PC-88 Paradise treatment. On the front and back, it looks like they used every 80s Mario illustration they could find, and I can assure you that Cowboy Mario doesn't appear in the game.
Excuse me, paisano. We'd like 3 orders of free spaghetti to go.
Inside, we have a big yellow floppy disk and a manual. Originally, there was a separate sheet of paper telling players to make sure their PC-88s are set to the faster H mode, but a previous owner of my copy has decided to cut that up and tape it to the inside of the manual instead. Another 80s Japanese PC from Sharp, called the X1, is mentioned here as well, so you can see that the manual was identical regardless of which system you bought it for. Now let's have a good look at that floppy disk. And insert it in the PC-88. After a short wait, we're taken to the title screen. My first reaction, what the hell is up with the color? Everything that's supposed to be white is yellow. Well, probably for performance reasons, they decided to restrict the game to only 4 colors, only half of what the system is actually capable of. Furthermore, probably for similar reasons, they decided to make the game compatible with the system's old V1 graphic mode, even though every model this game is compatible with also had the superior V2 mode. This limits the graphic capabilities of the game significantly. Due to this, I can set the PC-88 to either V2 or V1H mode. Either will work. By the way, the H here is referring to the same H mode mentioned in the cutout part in the manual. I also have to make sure the CPU speed is set to 4 MHz, or the game will run too fast. 8 MHz PC-88s didn't exist quite yet when this game was released. Another important setting for this game is memory weight, which needs to be changed to on. Without this, the game's speed is highly irregular, and Mario's jumping inertia is all wrong, making the game harder to play. One way you can tell this is definitely supposed to be turned on is the fact that the game over melody doesn't play in its entirety when turned off. Also in the visual category, look what happens when sprites overlap with objects in the background. What were they trying to do here? Transparency? All they needed to do was make the sprites overlap the background, and they couldn't even do that. But now let's get to the elephant in the room. This game doesn't scroll, and that alone is going to kill any chances of this being a decent version of Super Mario Bros. Sometimes you can't reasonably see objects on the next screen until it's too late. Now, the PC-88 doesn't have hardware scrolling, but regulars of this channel will know that PC-88 games often have scrolling implemented via software methods, which is almost always very choppy. In my opinion, any sort of scrolling the developers could have managed to implement here would have been far preferable to this. Finally, you can't tell just by watching this footage, but the control is terrible. It may look like it controls like the real Super Mario Bros. For NES, but I can assure you it does not. If anything, all your previous experience playing the real game will be a hindrance to learning the controls and timing here. I actually did get used to it a little, but it took a very long time to undo years of childhood experience. No matter how long I played, I would still sometimes stupidly run right into an enemy or fall down a pit for no apparent reason. At least this one has gamepad support, unlike Mario Bros. Special, so no weird keyboard port contraptions will be necessary here. Since gamepads for old Japanese PCs don't have any start or select buttons, you pause by pressing escape on the keyboard. The music doesn't sound too bad, though the tempo in most of it sounds a bit slower than it should. Like Mario Bros. Special, this game uses the PC-88 square wave channels, despite the fact that every model this game runs on also had FM sound. Using the square waves does make it sound a lot more like the NES, but it could have been more interesting to hear an FM sound rendition of the Super Mario Bros. Soundtrack. So, let's actually play through some of these stages. We're going to be using Mario since there's no two-player alternating mode and thus Luigi isn't in the game at all. Stepping on these Goombas and Koopa Troopas with the right timing does take some getting used to if you're accustomed to the real game. I quickly learned by accident that the one-up trick is really easy to do in this game due to the different physics. Another difference though is that the enemies can break out of it in this one, and thus it's difficult to perform infinitely. You'll probably want to do the trick multiple times here in World 1-1 before setting off for the rest of this brutally difficult game, since this version has no continues. It's possible to do the trick in some later stages too, but the first stage has a part where the trick is particularly easy to perform. This is one of the many things that leads me to believe that very little, if any, playtesting was done on this game, since the developers didn't seem to anticipate the player ever obtaining more than 9 lives, and didn't bother converting the remaining lives displayed on screen from hexadecimal. So if you can't read hexadecimal on the fly, you're going to have to just keep wondering how many lives AD is. You're also going to want to make sure you don't obtain more than 255 lives, or the lives variable will roll back over to 1. In World 1-1, you may also find one of the game's new collectible items. The Hudson B gives you 8,000 points. Moving on to World 1-2, this transition screen showing Mario going into the pipe is now controllable, so you can spend some time screwing around here if you want. I don't think there's anything to find though. Some of these stages, especially the early ones, seem to be loosely based on the ones in the real Super Mario Bros., but weirdly different. Don't bother trying to look for warp zones, this game doesn't have any, so you'll have to play through all 32 stages in order to finish it. Just like in the real game, every 4th stage is a castle where you'll have to jump over Bowser and be told that the princess is in another castle. In World 2-1, you'll have to deal with this broken springboard. I guess there's no way past this wall.
Oh no! Indeed! We're trapped!
Luckily, there are hidden blocks here, so you don't have to use the springboard if you don't want to. Guess they must have actually playtested this part and realized how broken this thing is. I only managed to successfully spring Mario over this wall on one occasion. World 2-2 is the first water stage. These are always a nice break from the harrowing platforming in this game.
Water! Water! Okay, which one of you plum scum keeps yelling he's dying of thirst?
Him!
Tough tortellini, this is my water!
My brothers and I would always try to imitate that line when we were little, but we couldn't possibly mimic the swallowing sound at that speed. But who needs water? In World 3-2, there's this new wing power-up, which makes Mario swim in mid-air for a short time. What a weird little Easter egg. The game also has some new enemies, like in World 3-4, where you'll encounter the barrels from Donkey Kong. They're quite hard to get around unless you manage to find this hidden Donkey Kong hammer power-up to take them out. World 4-2 is the first place you'll find these falling icicles, which seem to be placed just so that you'll have to stop and wait for them rather than rushing forward. This stage also has the crabs from Mario Bros. World 4-3 has something truly broken. A necessary platform in order to cross this gap sometimes doesn't spawn, seemingly at random. I'm not 100% sure I figured this out, but it seems to me that you need to make these platforms fall down 2 screens earlier, and then the necessary platform will spawn. Stage 4-4 is the first example of a maze-like stage, but it isn't too difficult to figure out the solution, especially if you have plenty of lives remaining to experiment with. 5-1 has more enemies from Mario Bros., and 5-4 is the first stage to feature some nearly impassable fire bars. The easiest way past them actually is to find the dead spots in the hit detection and use them to your advantage. 7-4 is the most difficult maze of the game. It requires you to travel above the ceiling and also go back through the pipe you just came through twice. And these fire enemies from Donkey Kong are the last new enemy you'll find in the game. The final stage is a harrowing experience. I'm not gonna lie, it took considerable effort for me to clear this stage. To add to the tension, the time limit is often a big problem in this game, and I didn't have much time left when I managed to finally finish this stage. Wow, I cleared every world. Congratulations. Surprisingly, the game actually has a credits roll. Hard to believe anyone at Hudson actually wanted their real name associated with this one. So who's responsible for this mess anyway? Well, lead programmer Yukio Takeoka is known to have worked on a couple of games I've played on the PC Engine and Super Famicom. Other people of note include one of the sound effectors, Fumihiko Itagaki, who worked on a number of mostly Hudson games, but surprisingly not usually in the sound department. Most well known is Takashi Takebe, who's listed as the producer here. Overall though, I would guess that Hudson didn't exactly assign their A-team to this title, and it shows. We all know Hudson is capable of much better than this. The only true port of Super Mario Bros. Special was for the Sharp X1. This version runs slower but smoother. The color is also significantly improved over the PC-88 version, though still not perfect. Most importantly, it uses Zelda-style scrolling rather than redrawing the whole screen like the PC-88. This does make things a bit less jarring when platforming between screens. Apparently, a lot of people like to emulate this version at 8 MHz instead of 4, which makes the music run way too fast, but the gameplay then runs a lot more like the real Super Mario Bros. This isn't possible though on an actual Sharp X1 system, since all the officially released models only have 4 MHz CPUs. There's also rumored to be a Korean port of the game for a Samsung computer called the SPC-1500, but this is the only known piece of evidence showing that it might have actually been released. However, the whole thing makes a lot more sense when you learn that the SPC-1500 is basically just a clone of the Sharp X1. So the SPC-1500 version of Super Mario Bros. Special, if it really exists, is probably just a Korean release of the X1 version. There are some interesting hacks based on Super Mario Bros. Special though. Someone took the stage designs from the game and hacked them into the original Super Mario Bros. For NES, in order to create Super Mario Bros. Special 35th Anniversary Edition. This is a much more enjoyable way to experience the unique stage designs of Super Mario Bros. Special, which are probably the best aspect of the game. There's even one guy on YouTube who redid the entire game SNES style, but this was done using the Flash game Super Mario Bros. Crossover, so it isn't playable on a real SNES. It's my belief that Super Mario Bros. Special could have been done a lot better on the PC-88, had the programmers put in the effort. Even in 1986, some bumpy scrolling should have been possible to implement had the right programming trickery been employed, and it also should have been possible to make the colors look much better than this, especially if they had bothered to take true advantage of the V2 graphics mode. And this may be a moot point, but just for the record, if this game had been released a year or two later, they could have even made the game with 8 MHz PC-88 models in mind, and then much more would have been possible. You could definitely make a version of this game that makes the PC-88 look less weak than this. I'm not a game programmer though, so maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. But since it's clear that they hardly even bothered to playtest this game, I think it can be said for sure that much more effort could have been put into the production of this game. The single-screen Mario Bros. Special for PC-88 was a decently fun new experience, as long as you can tolerate a little slowdown. The lack of scrolling capability wasn't an issue there, so it was obviously a much easier one to pull off. However, Super Mario Bros. Special needed real care and attention that it wasn't given, in order to have the slightest chance of being any good. Unfortunately, it's an objectively terrible game, and also the final Nintendo game that Hudson released for Japanese PCs. All of these games will remain an interesting oddity from Nintendo and Hudson's past, as well as rare and expensive collector's items. Hopefully we can look at more of them in the future. But in the meantime, I promise I'll be covering something better in the next PC-88 Paradise, so stay tuned. Thanks for watching this episode of PC-88 Paradise. This has been your host, Mr. Jakes from Basement Brothers. As always, I want to give a huge thanks to my patrons on Patreon and YouTube. And if you're new here, I hope you'll stick around and see what else Japanese PCs like the PC-88 and PC-98 have to offer. See you around in the next video.